Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Elephant Gambit. I get quite a few requests from viewers. You can always email me at thechesswebsite@gmail.com to let me know what videos you'd like to make, but the Elephant Gambit is one of the most requested videos, so I thought I'd go ahead and make a video on that. If you're not too familiar with how it starts, pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight f3, and then pawn to d5. Here we go right here. White has two different options. White can take here on d5 with his pawn, or the knight can take on e5. I always like to caveat these videos at the beginning. There are some gambits that are more sound than others. The Elephant Gambit is not the most sound opening out there. There's no reason to send me feedback telling me that this is not the best opening out there. You're not going to see it at the highest level. Magnus Carlsen's not going to be rolling this out at the next World Championship, but it is still a very fun gambit. There's a lot of room for White to mess this up. You may even run across it yourself as White. You can see how common this is. This opening right here, many players are playing this all the time. You may end up with someone playing pawn to d5, so just knowing how to combat that, or if you want to try it out yourself, because you're going to have so many opportunities to play this, I feel like it is a fun game, and I like gambits in general. I like to be pretty aggressive when I play, so hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Now for this video, we're going to assume that White's going to take one of these pawns. They could play something ridiculous and not, but for the most part, people are going to take. We're going to start looking at the pawn taking here on d5. Black's going to always push down here to e4, attacking this knight. Now, the best move for White is to play queen to e2, pinning down the pawn. The pawn can't take the knight because this king would be exposed. That would be an illegal move. White's not always going to play this, especially if you're playing a fast game. Someone's not familiar with the Elephant Gambit. They may feel like they need to move their knight. So we'll look at the different options. Knight to g5 is clearly going to be the worst. You have the queen just immediately take right here. But something like knight to g1 feels just as bad. You're giving up so much momentum in the early part of the game. Knight to f6. This is both attacking the pawn, also defending the square here on e4. Where does White continue from here? You can see no pieces developed. They're already behind the 8-ball from that respect. You could see pawn to c4. This feels somewhat normal, trying to control this pawn here on a d5. White is up material, so you want to hold on to that, but Black just needs to be continuously aggressive in this spot. Once your opponent moves back to g1, you have to push forward. Maybe knight to c3 here. You can castle on the king side. White may try to blow up the center of the board. Go ahead and exchange. That's fine. Once you move your pawn from the e file, this now exposes the e file. So your rook can come over to e8 anytime you want to. You may have an in-between move, knight to g4. This is protected by the light square bishop, so you don't have to worry about the queen here. This adds a lot of pressure to the square here on f2. The king is the only piece that's protecting that. So you could see knight to h3. This does now protect the square on f2, but now rook to e8. You can see all the pressure that Black is putting on White. Now you may not see pawn to c4. Maybe White tries to defend with knight to c3. Defend this pawn, attacking this pawn right here. Go ahead and take this pawn on d5. Now if they want to capture here, that's completely fine. If they don't, then you're even in material and you have a good board presence in the center. But let's say they do decide, okay, well, there's a free pawn here. I've already gone down this path. Let's go ahead and keep this material. Queen to e7 is the move. This sets them up to make so many mistakes because a lot of players will see this. They feel like their knight's being attacked and they'll try to defend with their pawn. Pawn to d3 makes the most sense, but pawn to f3 is going to be the exact same. Both of those fail because of pawn to f5. The knight's being pinned down, the knight can't move, and so the knight is going to fall by the pawn. There's just no way around that. Now, White may realize that's not the way to go. Could play queen to e2. This does stop the pin right here. Black, just continue. Knight to c6, develop material, get all your pieces developed into the game. Now, let's say White decides that, hey, same thing. I got to get some material out. I don't want to be passive with just pawn to d3 or d4, get my bishop out. I may not have time to castle, so knight to f3. You always want to get your knights involved pretty early. But now bishop down here to g4, pinning down the knight. White's in a tough spot right here. How does white continue? Now it has a few options, but maybe pawn to h3 attacking the bishop, saying, hey, I got to get you out of here. Black does not mind exchanging material right here. White really needs to take back with the pawn. If it takes back with his queen, it gets really tricky because knight down here to d4. This is attacking both the queen as well as the pawn here on c2. This is forking the king and the rook. The rook would fall. White also has to worry about later on pawn to f5. This knight here on d4 is also defending this square here on f5, which is attacking the knight that's being pinned down. So this is extremely bad. But if the queen doesn't take and the pawn takes here, then Black's still going to play knight down here to d4, attacking the queen, attacking this pawn here on f3, and preparing for pawn down to f5. So many things that white has to worry about. Very good for black. Now in this position, we already looked at the worst, knight to g5. We also looked at knight to g1. You're not going to see those as often. Just want to make sure that if you do see a mistake, you know how to capitalize. Knight to d4 makes sense, but if you see this, go ahead and just take with your queen down on d5. Now they could have a few options, one of which would be knight to b5. This is defended by the bishop. This does also attack the square here on c7. Not only is this a check forking the rook, it's also attacking the queen as well with that fork. So just be aware if you see this, you are going to want to bring your queen back here. I like to bring it back to d7. It does defend the square, also attacks the knight here on b5. So maybe knight to c3, knight to f6. This is going to be a fine game. Another move that you could see is pawn to c3. This does defend the knight right here. White doesn't have a lot of great options to defend that square, except just move the knight entirely. Knight to f6, this does defend the center of the board. Maybe pawn to d3, just go ahead and exchange, that's fine. This also opens up this long e file. It's also easier for black to get his light square bishop involved into the game. Get the knight here to c6, castle on the queen side if he wants to be very aggressive. So black has a lot of options. Now we can also come back. Maybe knight to d4 is not the move. Maybe knight to e5. If white's going to move the knight, which is not necessarily the best move, but knight to e5 is going to be the best. Same thing, go ahead and take with your queen down here on d5. Now, a couple options that you could see. One would be to bring the knight back here to c4. Okay, the queen is attacking the knight. The knight needs to move, so he brings it back here. This is defended by the bishop here on f1. But then you could just see knight to c6, just normal development, knight to c3, and then queen over here to f5. You still want to be aggressive. This does open up the door later on if you want to bring your bishop down here to c5. Then both your bishop and your queen are attacking the f2 square. So I'm playing this type of opening because I'm just looking for tons of attacks and see if my opponent will fall for one of those. Many times they absolutely do. Now if we come back, maybe it's not knight to c4. Maybe it's pawn to d4. Now, if you're not familiar, there is a real move called en passant you can actually take with your pawn right here when it's next to each other on the 4th rank. The first move, you only have one opportunity to do this, but you can go ahead and take. I recommend doing that. This also opens up for the queen to take the knight. The knight's usually going to come back. They could make a mistake and not take, but usually they're just going to come back with their knight. And then knight to c6. You can see both sides are equal in material. This is going to be fine. So that's what happens if they take and then they decide to go ahead and move their knights early on in the game. Now the best move from white is to play queen to e2. We talked about this earlier. If you see this, go ahead and play knight to f6 as we've been playing before. It defends the square, also attacks the d5 square. Pawn to d3, many times they'll try to blow up the center. So definitely try this. Queen takes on d5, maybe knight to c3, kicking this queen away. You can go ahead and play bishop down to b4. This does pin down the knight, can't take the queen. And you do want to get your pieces involved as quickly as possible. Maybe the pawn takes, the pawn here on e4. That's fine. Queen down here. And it's actually fine if white takes our queen. Black's going to have a better position. The knight takes here. You can see both sides are equal in material here, but black is definitely more aggressive. They really shouldn't take with their queen, but just want to let you know you do have a better game if they do. Now, instead of d3, they could try something else. Maybe they don't want to blow things up. Maybe knight to c3 is what they want to go with. And I would say this is probably the best option that they have. Just normal development, waiting to see how black's going to respond. Bishop to e7 is what I would recommend, getting ready to castle on the king side. Maybe the knight takes here on e4, castle on the king side, d4, and then the queen comes down, takes on d5. Now you can see that black is down a pawn in material. Will have to fight back. So as we said before, this is not the most sound gambit of all time. Not trying to convince anyone that it is. So if white plays optimally the entire way, then you will have to fight back. You'll have some very aggressive pieces that you can, but just know that white definitely would have a better game. Still not the easiest to find all of those moves, especially if you're not familiar with the elephant gambit. I do just like to point it out. Now those were the variations if the pawn takes here on d5. You'll also see the knight take on e5 quite regularly. And in this case, a lot of people will tell you to play bishop down to d6. I think it's kind of boring, but it is a very popular move that you'll see attacking the knight. The knight's going to have to move, or you're going to have to defend that. So maybe knight to g4 if that's the case. Pawn takes. If you see knight to c3, which is the most common move, this is I just want to make sure everyone's aware. You need to play knight to c6. Don't play the knight to f6, which you're used to playing, because the knight can just take right here. That's not what you want to see. The queen takes, knight recaptures here on e4. Things are not as good as you would like. But after knight to c6, this doesn't open up the opportunity for white to make a mistake, because knight taking on e4 is a huge mistake. Now, you don't want to play pawn to f5. It looks like that's good because you're attacking both the knights. One of the knights is going to fall. Unfortunately, white can play knight takes d6, and this is check, and so black has to respond. It's not going to go as well as you would hope. But what black can do is play queen to e7. This is pinning down the knight here on e4. No great way to defend this. Let's say pawn to e3. Doesn't really matter. Wherever white goes, pawn to f5 is now the move, and one of these knights is going to fall. You could also see, instead of that knight moving, another popular move would be pawn to d4. This is just happens more often because people try to control the center of the board. Go ahead and take with your pawn right here, and then they could see different options. Maybe the bishop comes here to c4. Go ahead and take the knight if you want to. You could also see knight to c3. Still go ahead and take the knight on e5. You could later on play knight to f6 to protect this pawn, but those are the main options that you'll see. The main reason I don't want to talk about too many of the variations from bishop to d6 is because that's not my preferred. If you're going to play a gambit, you're usually playing it because it's going to be fun, or you're really trying to catch your opponent off guard. And if that's the case, I think pawn taking here on e4 is the way to go. Gives you a lot of attacking options. One of the most common moves that you'll see from here is bishop to c4. It makes a lot of sense from white. He has both the knight and the bishop attacking this pawn here on f7. So what should black do? The answer is completely ignore the threat. If you're familiar with the Latvian Gambit, one of my favorite openings in all of chess, it just decimates white because they do not know how to play against it correctly. So the correct move, in my opinion here, is queen down to g5. It just puts so much pressure on your opponent. And now they can definitely play correctly, and the correct move, just so you know, is bishop takes on f7. You want to check your opponent. Well, black still has a very good game if white does this. But if white takes here on f7 and says, yes, this is defended, I'm going to attack both your rook and your queen, white is going to crumble because the threat of queen down here to g2. Now, if the knight were to continue, let's take the rook here. Great, I'm going to go ahead and take with my queen here on h1. Now there's two ways to defend against this. One is king up here to e2. The other one is bishop down to f1. King to f2 is actually checkmate. Now it's going to take a few moves to actually get there, but bishop to g4, king up to 8, e3 doesn't have other options. Queen over here to d1. You can already see the game is lost. The queen is gone. There's no way to even take that back. But from here, the queen is going to come back. It's just a matter of, okay, how long can white really have in-between moves before they lose? Knight to c6, it does not really matter. At the end of the day, the bishop comes down here to c5, check. Queen up here, there is going to be a checkmate. No way to stop that. There's a lot of variations that they could go from. If we come back and say the bishop comes back here to f1, it's still a very bad situation for white. Knight down to f6. This is an important in-between move because you don't want your opponent to play queen up to h5. This does stop that. It also allows protection on this pawn on e4. Still a lot of threats, so where does white go? Maybe knight to c3, but then bishop down here to h3. This bishop is being pinned down, a lot of pressure. Could also play something like bishop to g4. This is defended by the knight, so a lot of good options here. Now if we come back and say the queen is coming down here to g1 or g2, maybe the knight's not going to take. The rook comes over here to f1. Better move than the knight taking over here. Black doesn't care about this rook over on h8. It's not involved into the game at all. But now bishop comes down to g4, puts a lot of pressure on an opponent. Bishop down, e2. Bishop takes, queen takes, and then the king takes on f7, and black is up material. This is going to be good. Now we did say that the best move from white is to take with the bishop on f7. So I want to make sure everyone understands exactly how to play because it's not all terrible. Yes, you're going to be in a chaotic board situation, but the goal is just to get as much material involved into the game and put your opponent to the test. So king to d8 right here. And hopefully your opponent does something like bishop to g8. They feel like they already have material here, so they just continue to extend. You do not care about all this material because you're just going to continue and play queen down to g2. Maybe rook to f1, and then rook takes up here on g8. You can see this is a good situation for black. Maybe pawn to d4, defending this knight here on e5. You can see bishop down to h3. Now there are two pieces attacking this rook here on f1. Things are going to go extremely good for black. Now if we come back, instead of the bishop taking here on g8, does have some other options. Could play pawn to d4. This is protecting the knight here. Now the queen's going to continue. Come down to g2 attack. Rook over here to f1. Knight to f6. And this starts to put more pressure on your opponent. But you can see this is a good setup. White doesn't have a lot of huge threats anymore. And black has a lot of active pieces. He can now get his light square bishop involved into the game. He can get his dark square bishop involved into the game if he wants to later. He can get his knight involved. A lot of different options here. So that's why I really enjoy just taking with my pawn here on e4, because most of the time they're going to play bishop to c4. And if they don't, I still am going to have a very good game as black. So hopefully you enjoyed the Elephant Gambit. It is an extremely fun opening, and you just have so many opportunities to play it because if you look at the beginning, pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3 just happens so often. Before I sign off, I do want to let everyone know that for this video, we do have a sponsor. I want to take a minute to recognize them, and that is Dollar Shave Club. Yes, I am talking about that Dollar Shave Club. You may be seeing their commercials in the past. They have some of the funniest commercials out there. What you may not know is they have way more product than just shaving. They really have everything you need for your grooming routine. So if you're looking for showering, if you're brushing your teeth, if you are shaving, they have products for you, and they deliver them at a very cheap price, and the products are phenomenal. If you haven't tried them, I highly recommend them. We will have a promotion link right below this in the description. You can go to dollarshaveclub.com/thechess website. Again, that link will be in the video description below. If you've ever just wanted to try them out, I highly recommend clicking on that link. They have starter sets out there for you to try. So you if you want to try out with their shaving kit, their premium razor with their shave butter, you can get that for just $5. If you want their shower kit or if you want their oral care, my favorite toothbrush out on the market, I highly recommend it. After that, their refill packages are extremely cheap, couple dollars a month. You will not be disappointed. I definitely recommend checking that out. Thank you so much for the Dollar Shave Club for sponsoring this video and continues to help support this channel. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and make sure you check out the link at dollarshaveclub.com/thechess website.